Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. China's envoys are once more under the spotlight in South Korea, Canada and France. Today we're discussing Chinese diplomacy and the multilateral system. My guests today are Yeh-chung, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Professor and Chair, Jiho Chang, Keelung City Councillor of the Democratic Progressive Party, and Lev Nachman, National Chengchi University College of Social Sciences Assistant Professor. Professor Liu, Councillor Zhang and Professor Nachman, a very warm welcome to the show today. The South Korean Presidential Office says it's waiting for Beijing to take an appropriate measure over its Chinese envoy's remarks. Xing Haiming sparked controversy when he told a South Korean opposition leader those who bet on China's defeat in its rivalry with the United States will definitely regret it. Later, Yonhap news agency reported Yoon as telling his cabinet, judging by Ambassador Xing's attitude, it's questionable whether he has an attitude of mutual respect or promotion of friendship as a diplomat, according to some people who attended the meeting. He added, our people are offended with his inappropriate behaviour. Professor Nachman, let me come to you first. So South Korea believes that a line has been crossed. What is that line, and did he cross it?
So I think there's two things. First, the ambassador's comments ring very similar to sort of a wolf warrior diplomacy approach of being very presumptuous and very harsh on South Korea in ways that I think from South Korea's perspective are unwarranted. South Korea is sort of in a unique position relative to, say, Japan because of its proximity to China. And still has a very strong relationship with the United States. So South Korea, more than most other states in the Asia Pacific, has to do a very careful balancing between Beijing and DC. And South Korea does its best to keep that balance. So I think from South Korea's perspective, for the Beijing ambassador to accuse them of kind of presumptuously siding with the United States, I think from South Korea's perspective is for them insulting.
And what's at the root? What's the story behind, you know, the comments about betting on the United States?
So we know that the United States is taking a stronger position in the Asia Pacific, and we know that South Korea is part of that equation. South Korea has been enhancing its relationship with the United States, but that does not necessarily mean at the expense of lowering relations with China. And I think from Beijing's perspective, they want to send a very clear message to South Korea that they do not approve of South Korea's growing relationship with the United States. And sending that message is one matter, but the way in which that message was delivered, I think, was, again, presumptuously harsh from Beijing's side to South Korea.
Professor Liu, let's take a look at the quote again. Questionable whether Xing has an attitude of mutual respect or friendship. Our people are offended with his inappropriate behaviour. You know, what message is being sent? This, the Yonhap news agency is government affiliated.
Yes.
They were reporting on a cabinet meeting, so, you know, not a public event.
Right. I think right now, President of South Korea is actually sending a very clear message. The message itself was sent loud and clear in this way, because South Korea actually summoned China's ambassador on June 9th to issue a protest describing the comments made by the envoy as provocative and also a possible interference in internal affairs. This is very serious for Korea-China relations, because we all know that traditionally Korea adopts a certain kind of policy toward China, which is, we call it worship of the powerful, which means Korea would be in a tendency leaning to China because China is the powerful in this region. However, in the past few decades, we witnessed that for Korea, it began to enhance its relationship with Japan, with the United States. And I think that the last straw for this incident was at the Shangri-La dialogue earlier in June. Korea, Japan, and the United States agreed to have closer security ties, which antagonize definitely China again. If we are dating back this kind of bilateral differences a little bit back, we can see that actually in the year 2016, over the THAAD issue, China actually economically retaliated Korea for a period of time.
Do you want to explain what THAAD is?
Yes, during that period of time, because it was under Park Geun-hye administration, President Park was considered as a conservative president, which was trying very hard to strike a balance between China and the United States. However, due to the contingencies raised by North Korea, the South Korean government decided to join this SAD system and let the United States to deploy the system on its soil. So that antagonized China. China see that as a provocation.
And it's an anti-missile system.
Yes, yes. It's high altitude anti-missile system. Yeah, so it is in South Korea's interest. However, because of its radar system, Beijing was worried that the range the radar can cover would definitely reveal what China has in that region.
Right, I see. Okay, so sort of national security issues for China as well.
Yes.
Councillor Chang, you know, we opened the piece by saying that the presidential office was waiting for appropriate action or an appropriate measure to be taken. What do you think that is? I mean, there are calls in South Korea for either China to recall Xing or for him to be expelled as an envoy. What do you think South Korea wants to happen?
I think the tension has escalated quite quickly after such remarks were made. I think right now the South Korean government is probably waiting for some kind of an apology. It doesn't have to be a formal "I am sorry" kind of apology, but some kind of a remorse expressed by the China side is probably necessary to de-escalate this diplomatic tension.
Okay. Now, you know, in talking about envoys that have been, an envoy that could be, was the calls for this envoy to be expelled. In Canada, there was a diplomat who was expelled. And then there was a retaliatory, you know, Canadian diplomat that was expelled in China. Can we see any, you know, a common thread that runs through these? Talk us through what happened in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's, again, to answer from the two professors, I'm pretty sure this is, again, an extension of the wolf warrior policy. And I'm pretty sure they are not deliberate from the start.
It's not
so from the
deliberate.
get-go, it's probably, I think, we usually say that diplomacy is an extension of the domestic, but I think in China's case, most of the diplomats on the grounds in these different countries are now just doing their domestic politics. Like, this is not an extension. They are expressing their loyalty to the chairman, to the leader. Oh, and by that they are not considering any of the local consequences that their remarks might make. So I think they are not deliberate, they are not intended, but then they keep on happening, and I think that's a sign of Chinese leadership sort of falling apart because of the power struggles within their parties. So these are just like the consequences we see from those political struggles within.
Yeah, Professor.
Yes, if I may, let me add one thing to what we have discussed. In this South Korea case, it is also worth noting the ambassador from China, he made these very provocative comments, not in the face of the ruling party, but the opposition party, to the leader of the opposition party. So from which we can see that China seems to trying very hard to drive a wedge within the South Korea. I think that's why the president of South Korea was so angry over his behavior.
Yeah, reacted so strongly. Yeah, I saw that there were reports again on Yonhap where they objected to the envoy airing grievances in public. But
yes.
Yeah, I think basically speaking to the opposition is a key point. Professor Natman, we're going to take a look at a survey. There have been a few surveys of South Korean views of China. This is another one that shows that, you know, the views are quite negative. Let's take a look at this from Sinophone Borderlands. You can see here that South Korea has the biggest percentage of negative feelings toward China in the Indo-Pacific. So more than 80% negative of that 50 to 60% of respondents were very negative. Compare that with Japan, traditionally negative toward China, more than 70% negative of that, around 40%. Very negative. We've just taken the top 5 countries of that survey of 15 in total. So do you think that, you know, we're seeing quite strident, a strong position, as we discussed, from the president himself? Is public opinion influencing, do you think, foreign policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a lot of social scientists that spend a lot of time trying to understand the relationship between public opinion and foreign policy. The biggest challenge is that every country's domestic politics that sort of define big national elections are not always really driven by discussions on foreign policy. So for example, in the United States, foreign policy isn't a voting issue. Americans don't really value foreign policy as sort of part of the calculation of who they're going to vote for. And South Korea is another example of a country where foreign policy, at least kind of in this broad sense about South Korean-Chinese relations, is not necessarily at the front mind of South Korean voters. Instead, if there is some sort of foreign policy issues, it's more along the lines of North Korea or relations with Japan. Now, that doesn't mean that politicians aren't paying attention to how South Korean people feel. Obviously, if negative perceptions of China are so strong, then it would probably be politically bad for them to try to make overly positive steps with China. But to say that sort of public opinion in South Korea is driving the South Korean government's decision-making, I don't know that we really have enough data to show that, only because in the past this hasn't really been a major issue for driving South Korean voters. Now, that being said, there is going to be a presidential election in South Korea in 2024, and I do think this is something to keep an eye on because, of course, the South Korean-China-American trilateral relationship is going to be incredibly important as South Korea approaches its next presidential election. And I think that's going to be something that everyone is going to need to keep an eye on, especially if public opinion on China remains at such a current rate.
Interesting, Councillor Chang, in terms of the reaction from China, whether China is reacting to, again, public sentiment in South Korea. Initially, China did react to basically, you know, the foreign ministry as well as the president's comments, and they said that they expressed serious concern and dissatisfaction over Seoul's improper reaction. But a few days later, that language became more conciliatory from Wang Wenbin, and he said that China regretted South Korean media reports that had been inconsistent with the facts, and that promoting, you know, the development of South Korean-China ties serves both sides. And we do hope that Korea will meet us, China, halfway. So, do you see that as a climb down from the original criticism?
Yeah, of course. And referring to what the professor was saying, I would say that although we can't just jump to the conclusion that the public opinions have an influence on the foreign policies, but what we can say is that public opinions of their leaders and their leaders sort of either face or masculinity or how they react to pressures, those things matter to the public, especially when it comes time to a presidential election where integrity, characters are examined by the opinion, by the voters. So in that sense, I think what the Korean leaders are showing in terms of dealing with China is how the public sees them as leaders. Would they, would they break in face of pressures? So in that sense, there are, I think, causal relations, and China also gets that. That's why there is a sort of a slow climb down of the tension, and because of that, I think China is reading between the lines of these Korean leaders' remarks.
Professor Liu.
Yes, it is very, very interesting. I totally agree with our councillor. And adding to that, actually, one of the latest developments in South Korea was the opposition party, along with some members from the ruling party in their Congress, they are trying to pass a law putting certain kind of restrictions on those people they are considered as Chinese Koreans from their voting rights. So they are going to say that, okay, if you the Korea-China relations continue to be worsening, then those people, their rights to vote in Korea may be revoked in the future. So this is quite radical. I believe China also got the sense that if this is going to be true, then there is going to be a cross-partisan consensus in South Korea that China seems to be a threat, even an enemy. So this is not what China really wants to see.
And that would also explain why the envoy had got the leader of the opposition, and was trying to bring him over to their side. Okay, well, to discuss the current state of US-China tensions, my next guest is Patrick Cronin, the Asia-Pacific Security Chair of Hudson Institute. We begin by discussing where China's recent aggressions in the Taiwan Strait and over the South China Sea leave great power ties.
I think Admiral Kirby means that American armed forces are military professionals. They're prepared for contingency. Even though their mission is peaceful, that is demonstrating the right of innocent passage under international law.
If there are future incidents, how should they respond?
Well, carefully, but professionally. So they will try, obviously, to avoid a collision in the air or at sea. But they will not be deterred from operating in the waters and airspace that they're allowed to under international law.
The Wall Street Journal says that the goal of China is to push the US out of the Western Pacific, and Kirby says that isn't going to happen. So what will happen instead? I mean, where will this lead to?
The intent of China's strategy, the real aim is not just to displace US power. The aim is for China to change America's intention to defend Taiwan if attacked, and more generally to stand up for the current rules-based order in the region that China is trying to dismantle. So yes, China would certainly like to displace US power and push American military power as far back away from China as possible, all the way to the other side of the Pacific. At the same time, their real intent is to change our intention. It is an intent-based strategy, as is classical Chinese strategy. If they do not get their way, they have to find other means of pursuing their strategy. And that's sort of the US intent here, which is to maintain deterrence and deny them the military option that they may want to pursue to realize, say, unification with Taiwan, and at the same time, figure out other ways to manage our differences, including through diplomacy.
In response to General Li Shangfu's speech at the Shangri-La, you said that Li believes what he says, but also obscures Beijing's strategy for achieving Taiwan unification and national rejuvenation. What did you mean by that?
He is politically messaging the Chinese narrative. And that Chinese narrative is very one-sided. He's giving the one side that talks about American hegemony and America being sort of far away from its shores, but he doesn't talk about what China will actually do with that power. Will they pursue power in the region the way they pursued the crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, or the crackdown on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or the economic statecraft and coercion as they did against Korea over the THAAD missile batteries? And that's what has the region concerned, that he is obscuring China's real ambitions for larger imperial power, not just for grabbing Taiwan, but really for flexing control over the region.
To me, listening to Li's speech, there seemed to be a lot of almost exact phrases that they use, which are very similar to the same language that the US uses. Do you agree with that?
Oh, indeed. They like to pick up on American phraseology and put it right back in our face, but with a different meaning. So that's part of their public diplomacy and their messaging, and they've been very adroit at it of late in terms of trying to message constantly to many audiences. And they're about trying to change people's opinions. So their strategy really is aimed at changing political opinion more than it is, say, a military conflict. But they're preparing for a military conflict as well. So their words obscure the fact that they are both preparing for conflict if necessary, but also obscuring their real ambitions of how China wants to exercise sea power over the region.
And do you sense that people's opinions are being changed?
Well, opinion is in flux. It's a constant engagement, and I think that's the political struggle that we're engaged in. I think someone like John Kirby knows it very well, and so does General Li. And I think we're engaged in this back and forth, both on narrative and trying to win opinion. China's influencing opinion inside China. We know that there are growing voices in opposition to the Americans. We know that opinion in the region has soured on China. But at the same time, most people in the region want to see the two big powers, China and the United States, not head into conflict. As indeed, I think both leaders, Xi Jinping and President Biden, would agree. They also don't want a direct, open conflict between our two countries. But, we'll have to see how this opinion plays out over time on policy. I don't think China is going to prevail in terms of their intention to weaken America's resolve to maintain a rules-based order.
In terms of ASEAN nations, what is the opinion there of China?
They're increasingly worried about China's coercion and bullying, and that's why so many countries in the region are aligning with the United States to try to maintain deterrence and build their own capabilities to provide a barrier to coercion and potential use of force. Nonetheless, China's playing upon the gap that exists between businesses and people who want to increase business with China and those who are increasingly worried about the security implications of China's assertiveness.
You mentioned Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, and last year, it actually required the two leaders to talk to de-escalate tensions. Do you think that's what's required this year?
Yes, I do think that there needs to be a floor under the relationship so that it doesn't sink so low that it actually tips into conflict. And I think both leaders demonstrated that political will in Bali last November. We heard National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in an interview recently with Fareed Zakaria talk about the importance of building on that. And indeed, I think this is what we're seeing in the region, in American policy. We're seeing vigorous engagement. We just saw Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Crittenbrink and Sarah Barron of the National Security Council, the Senior Director for China and Taiwan policy there, in Beijing, trying to engage their counterparts on rules of the road. And when you put this together, along with John Kirby's warning about our preparedness for dealing with reckless maneuvers, you see the three constituent parts of U.S. policy for dealing with China in this region and over Taiwan. That is strategic ambiguity. The one China policy is inherently ambiguous and will continue to be so. Tactical clarity, we're prepared to deal with contingency, but vigorous diplomacy. And that's what we're trying to step up as we inevitably move, we hope, toward a Xi Jinping, Joe Biden meeting later this year. It is important for us to vigorously engage in diplomacy, but it is also important to manage perceptions, and those perceptions should not be allowed to be portrayed in the region as American weakness and desperation, in Chinese superiority, and somehow that they've got the high ground on diplomacy. The act of diplomacy should be continuing no matter what the relationship is, whether it's good or bad, because diplomacy is just one facet of policy and one instrument of policy, and should always continue.
What's your opinion about the sanctions on General Li? The Chinese would like those sanctions to be lifted ahead of any talks.
Well, I think first we have to separate the fact that the sanctions on General Li are not the obstacle that has caused China to resist diplomacy. China's resisted diplomacy because they're trying to manipulate public opinion and trying to send a message back to Washington that they don't really want to deal with America on our terms. They want to deal with America on their terms, and that means from a position of strength. But I do think, on the other hand, sanctions in this case are not helpful, because when you're dealing with the top military official of the fastest growing military in the world, you want to be able to keep those lines of communication open, and you don't want to be hamstrung artificially by sanctions. So the U.S. needs to obviously find a way to hold countries accountable when they act aggressively, for instance, purchasing weapons against a country that has invaded a neighbor. But at the same time, they need to maintain the diplomacy with senior officials. So once General Li became the defense minister, in effect, the U.S. needed to basically suspend those sanctions on him and place them back on the institution that procured the weapons that brought about the sanctions in the first place.
Another example, perhaps, is, again, the Wall Street Journal. saying that China perhaps is playing hardball in that it doesn't want President Biden to impose the restrictions on US investment in China. Now, given Lloyd Austin at Shangri-La said that dialogue is a necessity and it's not a reward, do you think that this position should dictate, what the Biden administration does?
Lee's rebuffing of talks with Secretary Austin has to be dealt with on its own terms. That this kind of dialogue needs to happen, and Secretary of Defense Austin is absolutely right. It doesn't need to be linked or tied to anything else. I think in his case, he was referring to looking like America was weak and wanting these, was going to somehow cave in and give concessions just for talking. But I think the trade issue, the de-risking issue, as Jake Sullivan and others in the Biden administration have talked about, indeed, the G7 countries recently talked about the de-risking of policy so that they can protect critical technology and their competitiveness for dealing with China without decoupling the economies from China. Both of these things need to happen. That is, we both need to be able to talk about security with the PLA and with China generally, and we need to be able to protect our economies, our intellectual property, and our competitive nature of our technologies so that we can compete with China peacefully going forward. And so we need both security, diplomacy, and de-risking.
That was Patrick Cronin of the Hudson Institute speaking to me earlier. Professor Nachman, there has been news of envoy, Chinese envoy Liu Xiaoye, who may be, according to some Hong Kong reports, coming back to China, becoming the president of a NGO that deals with non-governmental diplomacy. Why is this a big deal?
So Liu Xiaoye is, of course, the most infamous of the wolf warrior diplomats, who has made so many remarks over the years that have caught the eyes of not just people here in Taiwan, but of governments around the world, ranging from things like saying that if China unifies Taiwan, that Taiwanese people will go under re-education, or perhaps more recently making comments insinuating that places like Ukraine or other Eastern European countries are not legally countries under international law, or other such sort of outrageous, factually incorrect statements. But his kind of brazen wolf warrior diplomacy has really earned him a reputation, not just because of what he said, but because Beijing has allowed him to say it for so long. We talk about these other examples of Chinese ambassadors around the world sort of making their very domestic sort of cases to Xi Jinping to show their loyalty, and really Liu Xiaoye set the precedent for this kind of behavior. And so much of the institutions of how Chinese diplomats behave now have really been defined by Liu Xiaoye for so long. So he's really become a fundamental political character. Even though he's just a diplomat in France, he's really a fundamental person to know about. So the fact that he's finally being recalled and perhaps stepping down from diplomacy is a very big deal. Now, even though I think there's going to be people that say, he's finally getting what he deserves and getting recalled for his comments in the past, but I don't know that's necessarily true, because he's been making these comments for so long with never any sort of meaningful repercussion. And even though the comments that he made about Eastern European countries were not so long ago, there was no real immediate repercussions for him when that happened. I also think it's worth knowing that Ambassador Liu is actually 58, 59 years old, and 60 is actually about the age that you start to see ambassadors starting to retire or at least return to China. So, this could be a couple of things. It could be a legitimate effort by Beijing to sort of rope in the leading wolf warrior. It could also be coincidentally this time that he was going to be coming back anyway, or it could be a nice combination of both, in which Beijing gets to sort of bring him back without sort of any major repercussion on their part, by being able to say, well, it was just his time to come back.
Professor Liu, would you like to comment on that? I mean,
Right.
I noticed that there aren't that many English language reports of this. There are actually
Yes.
far more.
Yeah, it's quite
Chinese
interesting
language.
because I totally agree with what Leif just mentioned. Because if we're looking at how Korea diplomats, they have their own mission around the world, usually they will follow the party lines. And when Xi Jinping took office, it is always following Xi's lines. So for Liu Xiaoye, I think it is quite interesting when he made those kind of very provocative statements. Beijing's reaction was silence in the first place, and then trying to say something conciliatory than his comments. And this time, the rumor has it saying that Liu Xiaoye is going back to chair an NGO in charge of NGO diplomacy, something like that. So this is quite interesting, and this seems to be a reasonable arrangement in China if we consider, if we take China's political circumstances into consideration. Because once you have this kind of wolf warrior in the outpost, then you have to summon, to recall him to come home. If you do not grant him an honorary position, then that will be a disaster to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it is quite interesting. So in Chinese, we usually says 名声暗降. So it's like I promote you to an honorary position, but in that position, you don't have any capacity to do anything meaningful. Yeah, so I think this is maybe right now the best approach to deal with this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy.
Councillor Chang, Professor Nachman mentioned, Liu Xiaoye's comments about re-educating Taiwanese following a so-called unification or reunification. Let's go back to that a bit. So what do we know about re-education camps or the process of re-educating when we look at Xinjiang?
I think if we look at it closely, it basically objectified people. So they treat these people as objects, and if they don't abide to the party line, they have to be re-educated into the party lines so that they can be seen as human again. They can be seen as citizens again. So that being said, if we consider the recent events that we face, the Me Too movement and all this misogyny that we're not agreeing with, this is misogyny on the state level. So they are seeing no one as human beings. And only if you say the right things, if you think the right way, will you be seen as a human again. So that's it's.
So they don't have any rights at all. They are treated as
of course,
treated inhumanely.
Yeah, and not only that, I think what Liu Xiaoye was saying, such a drastic way of putting things like that. I think he was not talking to either the French public or the Taiwanese public. That to me seems more like a pitch interview for him to get back into the move
CCP,
up the ladder within the Chinese political system.
Right. Yeah.
So again, that is pledging his allegiance, his loyalty to the party line, to the party ideology, showing that he is the most appropriate diplomat. And that also sends a message to all the other diplomats, how they are competing to be more fierce, more wolf warrior-like.
Yeah, more loyal to Xi Jinping. You said that it wasn't drastic, but does that, what's happening in Xinjiang, so you don't actually think that he's saying that this could happen to Taiwan?
Of course it is. Drastic meaning that what happens in Xinjiang is bad enough. And he wants to, it's because it seems almost, it's very different, it's two different things. Xinjiang is part of China, and Taiwan, despite his protests, is not part of China. So sending Taiwanese people to whatever Xinjiang camp that he wanted is it's much more difficult. So that's why I said it's drastic. Because I'm not saying that this can't happen. This is happening, and it's happening in Hong Kong right now. The people, the youngsters who got arrested in 2020, they are being re-educated within the Hong Kong prisons.
Yeah, the recent reports that have come out.
So of course it is happening, and it will happen if we don't keep China at bay.
Okay, so maybe a warning for Taiwanese. And now to diplomacy on the multilateral level. The United States has announced it wants to rejoin UNESCO, the UN Cultural and Scientific Agency, after leaving in 2017. Officials say the decision to return was motivated by concern that China is filling the gap left by the US in UNESCO policymaking. Concerns centre on the promotion of different world orders and setting standards for things like artificial intelligence and technology education around the world. No country raised an objection to the US's announced move, which will face a vote by member states in coming weeks. The US was previously the agency's single biggest funder, a position now held by China. So the US wants to counterbalance China's influence in UNESCO, but UNESCO is not, a sort of major hitter in terms of a geopolitical agency. Can you explain, what it does and how it can influence?
Yeah, so, the UN has so many different branches of trying to bring the world together and trying to promote things like cultural exchange, increasing literacy around the world, trying to memorialize important heritage sites around the world. That's what UNESCO does. Think of it sort of like trying to promote a softer form of security around the world. Usually we think of the UN, we think of things like, guns and bombs, but there's so much more to security than just, hard military, and UNESCO really kind of serves that very important role of trying to make sure that countries are invested in sort of the preservation of world peace beyond just sort of these hard means. Obviously, it was incredibly disappointing when the United States withdrew from UNESCO under President Trump and the Republican administration. I think it's wonderful that the US is trying to get back in and that it does not seem like there are any countries objecting to the US's return. And if it's being done so under the premise of we need to counterbalance China, who is filling the gap that we left, I think it's a smart move by the United States to try to make sure that it is still able to offer sort of its own meaningful contributions to these goals of sort of promoting cultural exchange, promoting education, and not being left on the sidelines while the rest of the world continues on these goals, while the United States was isolated.
Councillor Chang, just sort of building on what Professor Knappman said there, in terms of the softer side to security, I think you said, yeah. Let's pick up on one example. So UNESCO decided to recognize the old city of Hebron in the West Bank as a Palestinian World Heritage Site. Now, of course, this is highly controversial. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, of course. I think what UNESCO was doing is to being a politician. I would say this is a highly political move, but in that sense, UNESCO is taking a side. It's taking a stance that by recognizing specific cultural artifacts, it's also recognizing some form of political recognition. But of course, political comes next. But the culture, if the culture gets through, then politics is not going to be far away. I think that's the lessons we can learn from that.
Professor Liu, just want to bring you into that. I mean, that is one example of, as Councillor Chang said, it's essentially politics. He said, it's coming down. In a very, very controversial debate coming down on one side. Do you think that is the view, that is the role of UNESCO?
One thing is very, very important. I think the US decision to return to UNESCO is very, very important and very imperative for the United States, because if we are looking back in the past few years, there are 16 specialized agencies under the UN framework. When China has its utmost power over those organizations, back then China was holding 4 seats as the leadership among these 16 organizations, which is 1/4 strong.
Right.
Yeah, so this is huge. Right now, China is still holding the FAO, one of the specialized agencies focusing on food and agriculture. So for the United States, it is very, very important to return to the arena, to have a seat at the table. This is quite important because in the year 2011, that was the year Palestinian Authority got admitted into the UNESCO.
Right.
And that was then, Washington was very angry over it. So the Obama administration was saying that, okay, we stop paying UNESCO our contribution. We are not going to do so. And then until the year 2018, the United States fully dropped from this organization. And that was under the Trump administration. So as we can see, this is totally political, because from the US perspective, if UNESCO is making certain decisions to grant any status, especially state status, to the Palestinian Authority, then Israel is opposing it, then the United States would definitely oppose it. So this is totally a political game within the UN framework. But until now, as we can see, the Biden administration reconsidered the importance of returning to this UNESCO, because China's influence is still growing, and China, with its influence in those international organizations, was trying to make its own right to speak loud and clear. So this is not good for multilateralism from the US perspective.
Lev, let me bring you in there. So, you know, Professor Liu outlined very clearly, you know, the influence of China through those figures. A quarter of the heads of the agencies are essentially, you know, Chinese. So, do you think that the Biden administration is acting fast enough? I mean, should this have happened much sooner?
I mean, my opinion is that the United States should have never left in the first place.
Right.
But now that we are back in, I think there's a lot of catch-up to be made.
Not yet back in.
Not yet back in, but hopefully soon back in. You know,
There's been no reaction against it.
It's just going to take time and resources for the United States to be able to have meaningful influence and a voice in these different UN bodies. And because we've been gone for so long, and because China has now established so much of its own influence in these places, I think it's really going to be an uphill battle for the United States to regain its footing.
Yeah, and as you said, that just takes time. That brings me on to, you know, an approach that China is master of, something called discourse power, or the right to speak. Do you want to tell us about how, you know, this fits into the UN system?
Yes, for the Chinese part, I'm not suggesting that we should exclude China from all international or intergovernmental organizations, but it is quite important to make sure China joins these international organizations and is going to abide by all the rules already there. But from Chinese perspective, they tend to have a certain kind of tendency, which is they are going to not only to be the rule taker, they are going to be the rule maker. So this is a big shift in its foreign policy. From the Chinese perspective, this seems to be very, very reasonable. But from the rest of the world, maybe people would say, okay, if China got this kind of rule maker role to play in the future, would China, because of its different political system, its different taking on national interests, or all those of things, it seems to be a little bit risky for the rest of the world that if China is leading, would China rock the boat to change the status quo, to change the norms and rules we decide to follow by in the past few decades?
Yeah, I mean, and this is exactly what we're talking about, you know, beyond this show, and that we have been for months now, in terms of, you know, just China wanting to create a different world order. And I understand that's the fear that the United States have. Just on the very final question, Councillor Chang, you know, we've hinted at this, the reason why the US had objections to UNESCO was the admittance of Palestine. Now, Taiwan also wants to be recognized by the UN system. How does Taiwan's claims compare to that of the Palestinian Authority?
Well, I think that's just a great example. If the U.S. makes its way back to the UNESCO, maybe some cultural and historical sites and artifacts of Taiwan can start to be considered into the UNESCO's list. And that is going to draw a lot of political debates. But again, it's a cultural issue. It's a historical issue. Isn't necessarily a political issue. At least we can make it into a cultural issue, and that might give Taiwan a chance to be, you know, in some form of engagement and participation in a subsidiary UN institution. And I would add that a unilateral US is an easy target for China to target, to isolate, and to hold its discourse against, around with. But a multilateral U.S., a U.S. that's highly and intensely engaged in the multilateral institutions, that is what China is yet to grasp. Like China has no way of or difficulty deal with that. And it's not because China didn't have the ability to, but for the current Chinese leadership, they have this stiffness, they have this inability to deal with a multilateral U.S. And that's, for Taiwan, is a good thing.
But do they recognize that, as you call it, a multilateral U.S. embedded in the multilateral system, do they recognize that that's something they should fear?
Of course.
They do.
I think they are, because I'm pretty sure there's nothing in their textbooks saying how they should deal with that kind of a U.S. because they have been dealing with a unilateral U.S. since 2016.
Because of Trump's kind of protectionist, policies.
Yeah, it was easier for them to it's an easy target, it's an easy enemy, but highly engaging U.S. That's a new enemy that China is yet to learn how to deal with.
Very interesting. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Professor Liu, Councillor Zhang, and Professor Nachman, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Yeh-chung of Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section. Take care and see you next time. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yeh-chung.
This very aggressive form of cultural revolution-like politics in China seems to be moving forward in this modern era.
This grave injustice is happening.
We need that kind of mindset to prepare for the warfare.
What implications does this have on Taiwan and the region as a whole?
Just like Ukraine right now, you need people to understand we're doing this for our own country.
Reaffirmed our support for the Taiwanese ability to make their own decisions about their own future.
It's very hard to duplicate in the short time. Taiwan still can continue being the leading position if we put efforts on R&D.
And you are riding on a wave. This is exactly the time you need to double down.
I did not realize I am actually running to be the first Asian woman in the state senate. Our next generation, they can see Asian American is as equal and have the same platform.
Taiwan Talks provides a platform for the voices and perspectives that are shaping our country.
Taiwan Talks, Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. on Taiwan Plus.